Hey golfers, what if I told you there was one simple move in your backswing that 90% of golfers get completely wrong? And this one thing also has to do with your consistency of ball striking and your distance. Don't you want to make sure you're doing this thing correctly? Stay tuned for this video and we'll work through it together. So this one move that so many golfers get wrong has to do with the wrist hinge in our backswing. So many of my students overthink this. They do it too much, they don't do it enough, they don't understand what they're supposed to be doing, and it's really not as complicated as they're making it out to be. So in this video, we're gonna talk about why we need wrist hinge, talk about how to hinge our wrist, and talk about when. Okay, so all three of those are questions that I get and are sometimes misunderstood. So hinging of our wrist, right, this levering of our wrist is super important in our golf swing if we want speed, if we want height to our golf shots, if we want distance. Okay, so if I have an 8-iron here, and if I hit an 8-iron with little to no wrist hinge on either side of my golf swing, okay, it was solid, but it flew pretty low and maybe 100 yards, right? Maybe not even 100 yards. So it would be very hard for me to hit the ball far enough from the tees that I'm supposed to be playing and high enough for the ball to stay in the air long enough and to be able to land on the green and stop. Okay, versus if I add wrist hinge to my golf swing on both sides of my backswing and follow through, ball goes probably 3 times as high and goes probably 40 yards further. So we need a wrist hinge in our swing to be able to hit the ball far enough and to be able to hit it high enough. So if you don't have hinge in your swing, you're definitely giving up a lot of power and speed that you would be able to create just by adding that simple move. Okay, so how do we hinge our wrist? Okay, that's an important thing to understand. So first of all, I want to talk about it with each hand separately. Okay, so for a right-handed golfer, we're going to talk about our left hand, our lead hand here. And when we take our proper grip, we have kind of the heel pad of that left hand of that grip on top of the handle. And when I'm hinging the club, I want to feel like I'm pushing down on that heel pad. And you can see that it's almost like a hammering motion. If there was a tee in the ground or a nail in the ground, I should be able to hammer that nail into the ground just by hinging my wrist, right? Not by lifting my arms, not by lifting my body, just by pushing down on the handle. You can see how that club starts to work up, okay? So that's with the left hand. Now, when I do that, you can see my left arm stays nice and extended and straight when I lever that with my left wrist. But you can see, and even with my right hand on, when I do that, this left wrist is pretty cupped, right? So at address, depending on your grip, you're gonna have some amount of kind of extension or cupping here. And we know that in our golf swing, if we keep that for too long in the backswing, the club face is gonna be open. And if we return with that, right, we're not gonna have the amount of shaft lean that we need in order to compress the golf ball and max out our distance and our contact. So at some point in our swing, we're gonna have to go from this extended cupped wrist position to be able to get it a little bit flatter to control the club face. Okay, so if I hinge up this way, but now I see that it actually becomes even a little bit more cupped. Okay, so that's where the right hand comes in. So with our right hand, we are going to be essentially taking our knuckles of that right hand and bending them backwards towards our forearm. This is the motion that we want with that trail hand with that right hand. So if we couple that with the hinge and then the extending back of the right arm, now you can see how halfway back that left wrist is now flat, not cupped, right? Left wrist is now flat with that forearm. And you can see from face on that I make this nice kind of L position here, this 90-degree angle. My left arm is straight. I've hinged the club by the time my left arm is parallel to the ground, and it looks great. Versus a lot of times, if my students are not hinging the club, they'll look more like this going back, right? There's no leverage here. And then what happens typically is they know they need some leverage and they end up bending their arm in order to create that leverage. And now we've lost that width of the arm. We've got to throw it back out at some point. It just becomes a disaster, okay? So we don't want that. We don't want to have to deal with that timing. Now, are there some variations of how much and when we can hinge our wrist? Yes. If you look on tour, there are some very good players who hinge a little bit earlier. There's some good players who hinge a little bit later. But if we're trying to build a really efficient swing, we're gonna kind of talk about that middle of the road, that kind of corridor of where we want to see that club being hinged by. So yes, are there exceptions? Absolutely. And so you just need to find what works best for you. But this is a very kind of middle of the road, making sure that we're getting hinged by a certain point to make it so we're not having to last minute do anything in our backswing or our downswing to have to compensate for poor wrist hinge or no wrist hinge. So the feeling with the left hand, we're gonna push down, right? So just feeling that, like if you're hammering a nail, again, it's just with your wrist, right? I'm not bending my arm to make that happen. That is incorrect. So hinging up and down, doing that a couple of times. Okay, so now if I put my right hand on, I'm gonna feel as I turn my chest back, I'm gonna feel those knuckles go back, right? So you can see when that happens, I get a nice fold in that trail arm. That club is set nicely on plane, right? If there was a extension or a laser coming out of the handle, it's pointing kind of on an extension of my target line behind the golf ball, right? So a lot of times when I see incorrect wrist hinge, right, I'll see the knuckles kind of go down this way, or they really aren't doing anything at all. So as we go back, feeling those knuckles this way, going back towards the forearm, getting a nice set there. And when I combine that with the left wrist pushing the handle down, we end up in this really great position, flat lead wrist, which is controlling the club face, and this leverage by the time that left arm is parallel to the ground. And so the timing, my preference is that by the time your left arm is parallel to the ground in the backswing, we have this kind of 90-degree L position with your lead arm and the shaft. So if you take a video of your swing from face on, so for somebody that I would consider hinging their wrist too early, right? So the shaft is already parallel to the ground and my hands are basically where they were when I started, right? So the reason that I do not like that is because you can see, even though my wrists are technically in a good position for later in my swing, you can see that I haven't turned my body at all. My shoulders haven't turned at all, right? So a lot of times this ends up being a swing where there's not enough torso rotation, not enough body action, and it just gets real handsy and armsy. So if you notice that your club is set to 90 degrees or shaft parallel to the ground before your hands are even to your right thigh, then I would say that's probably a bit too early, okay? Vice versa, if you get to where your left arm is parallel to the ground and we don't see any wrist hinge, I would say that's a bit too late. Are there some players that hinge last minute and can time that? Yes. But what I find with most amateur golfers is that when we get to this position is that we end up bending that arm to create that leverage and not really having any wrist hinge, which now as we come down, right, we're not gonna have enough angle to create that ideal impact position that we're all trying to get to. So when the shaft is parallel to the ground, ideally, you can see how my hands are kind of just past the middle part of my right thigh, right? And then by the time I get to left arm parallel, I've got my full 90-degree hinge already set there, flat lead wrist, knuckles back. Okay, so that is my preference for wrist hinge. Again, you found a variation that works for you, but this is where I find that most golfers thrive and don't get too handsy. They still get enough hinge. They're able to maintain the width of that left arm and not have it collapse at the top because there's not enough wrist hinge by the time we get to the top of our backswing. Okay, so here's kind of 2 little drills that you can do to work on feeling the correct amount of wrist hinge. So this one, you're not gonna hit a ball, but I always tell my students, I said, pretend like you're on the tee box of a par 3, the group in front of you still on the green, so you're just hanging out, waiting until they clear the green to hit, right? And so you're just kind of standing there talking, you got the club in your right hand, just kind of let it swing back, hanging out. What's up, Mags? How you doing? Right? I'm not thinking about it. And you can see how the club is just naturally swinging up, right? I've got light grip pressure, just swinging the club back. It's naturally wanting to hinge without me thinking, right? This will be super awkward to do, right? Not letting it hinge, right? The club head is the heaviest part of the club. So with the momentum of you swinging back, it wants to swing up once we reach a certain point in our backswing, right? It would also be super awkward for me to just naturally start hinging it way too early, right? I'm just letting my arm swing back, letting the club swing, the natural flow and momentum. So I think a lot of times, if we think of it this way, it might help us stop overthinking about when it should happen and how it should happen, right? If we just let the club swing, it naturally wants to hinge at the right time, okay? So kind of a cool concept there if you feel like that you overthink the how and the when of the timing of your wrist hinge. Okay, so the second drill is where we're actually gonna hit a ball. So you're gonna take your setup and we're going to push the handle down, just like we talked about at the beginning. Kind of push the handle down with our wrists, right? Not our arms bending. Push the handle down. So club is up, you know, in the bottom part of my face here, right? So I'm gonna hinge and then I'm just gonna turn my shoulders and come through and hit the golf ball. Okay, so hinge, turn, hit. So it just allows us to ensure that we're getting the right amount of hinge, right? Because we're getting it done pre-swing. And if we have not been doing this, it's gonna feel, you're gonna feel the correct amount of hinge, what it feels like to swing with the correct amount of hinge, what it feels like to deliver the club to the golf ball after having the correct amount of hinge in the backswing. Okay, so hinge, turn, hit. Okay, so great drill to feel the correct amount of hinge. Let yourself just be a natural human being. Let the club swing with that trail hand, right? It's gonna hinge the right amount, the right time, and you'll see how kind of simple it is and how maybe you're overcomplicating things. Okay, so try those 2 drills, work on kind of feeling the left hand, what it should be doing, right hand, knuckles going back, and I promise you it will help clean up your contact, help get the ball to fly higher and further, and you will notice a big difference in your ball striking. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below, and I'd love to help clarify anything. And if you'd like to work with me a little bit more individually, one-on-one, we can do so through the Skillest app, and I have that link down in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you later.